Okay, this is Federalist number 10, part 3. I mentioned this website, the last video, teachingamericanhistory.org. So utilize that, use that as a reference. And I also said one of the books that I have looked at that explains faculty, the word faculty as used 2 centuries ago. It's by Daniel Walker Howe, and it's called Making the American Self. I showed it to you last time. Making the American Self. So I'm going to leave this here so people who watch the video know what we're talking about. I will continue. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere, brought into different degrees of activity, according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. Notice Madison is very, very realistic. He says when you have free government, you are going to have faction. And to deal with it, you have to be realistic and you have to create a constitution, write a constitution that will look at human beings as they are, not as you wish them to be. It's why he says people have passions in a bad sense. They only want to attach themselves to a faction. They are selfish. They're greedy. So he says you have to form a government that keeps all these in mind. Okay, I will go to the next paragraph. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interest would certainly bias his judgment, and not improbably corrupt his integrity. With equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet, what are many of the most important acts of legislation but so many judicial determinations? Not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens. And what are the different classes of legislators but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? Is a law proposed concerning private debts? It is a question to which the creditors are parties or on one side and the debtors on the other. Justice ought to hold the balance between them. Yet the parties are and must be themselves the judges, and the most numerous party, or in other words, the most powerful faction, must be expected to prevail. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged, and in what degree, by restrictions on foreign manufacturers, are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and the manufacturing classes, and probably by neither, with a sole regard to justice and the public good. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality. Yet there is perhaps no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptation are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pocket. Again, it brings to your attention the fact that human beings are greedy, especially when you give them power, you give them a government position. They will try their best to increase their power, to increase their wealth, to show off. So it's constantly saying you got to be realistic. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. So you cannot do anything about how faction comes about, because in a free government it's going to come about. But you can control its effects. And he is going to tell us slowly in the next few paragraphs how you can do that. So I'm going to stop here. Make sure that you go to this website and check it out. And when you can, read this book, or at least 2 chapters of it. Chapter 2 and 3, it talks about faculty psychology and some of the things, how people looked at things, how intellectuals looked at some of these vocabularies and ideas 2 centuries ago. So I'm going to go to part 4, and we will continue.